The morning mist hung thick over Millbrook Valley like a shroud, muffling the sounds of the bustling marketplace that had sprung up behind the old courthouse. It wasn't the kind of gathering decent folks usually attended, but desperation had a way of drawing crowds from the darkest corners of society. Wooden crates served as makeshift platforms, and the air reeked of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and something far more sinister, the scent of human misery being bartered like livestock. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Thornfield sat motionless on his black stallion at the edge of the crowd, his weathered leather gloves gripping the reins with white-knuckled intensity. The scars that ran like twisted rivers across both his hands throbbed in the cold morning air, a constant reminder of the fire that had taken everything from him 3 winters ago. He hadn't come here for this spectacle. His original purpose had been simple: purchase supplies for the coming season, maybe trade for some decent seed grain. But something about the hushed whispers and sideways glances had drawn him deeper into the valley than he'd intended. The auctioneer, a corpulent man named Silas Cranston, wiped sweat from his brow, despite the chill. His voice carried the practiced rhythm of someone who'd sold everything from prize bulls to human souls without losing a wink of sleep. The crowd before him was a mixture of curious onlookers, opportunistic predators, and men whose moral compasses had long since shattered under the weight of their own failures. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cranston bellowed, his voice cutting through the morning fog, "we come now to our final lot of the day. Most unusual circumstances, I'm afraid. Girl of perhaps 16 years, maybe 17. Hard to tell given her condition." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard whispers about these kinds of auctions in the larger towns, places where the law turned a blind eye to transactions that shouldn't exist in civilized society. But he'd never witnessed one firsthand, never felt the collective shame of humanity pressed so close he could taste it on his tongue. A small platform had been erected near the courthouse steps, and now a figure emerged from the shadows behind it. She was slight, dressed in a faded grey dress that had seen better decades, her dark hair hanging in loose waves around shoulders that seemed too narrow to carry whatever burden had brought her to this moment. But it was her eyes that stopped. Marcus cold, or rather, the white cloth band that covered them completely. She moved with the careful, measured steps of someone navigating a world built for sighted people, one hand trailing along a rope that had been strung as a guide. When she reached the center of the platform, she stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to sounds the rest of them couldn't hear. There was something ethereal about her stillness, something that reminded Marcus of the way deer froze in clearings just before dawn. "Blind since birth, poor thing," Cranston continued, his voice carrying a false sympathy that made Marcus's skin crawl. "Been living on charity from the church over in Riverside County, but their funds have dried up, you understand. Times being what they are, they can't afford to keep feeding mouths that can't contribute to the work." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some men chuckled darkly, others spat into the dirt. Marcus noticed how they looked at her, not as a person, but as a commodity to be evaluated. His scarred hands clenched tighter around the reins. "Now, she's got some peculiar qualities," Cranston went on, warming to his pitch. "The church folks mention she's got what they call healing hands, claims to be able to ease pain with just a touch. Course, that might just be superstition, but you never know. Some of you might find that interesting." The girl's head turned, slightly at the mention of her supposed gift, and Marcus caught a glimpse of her profile. There was something dignified about the way she held herself, despite the degrading circumstances. She didn't cower or plead, she simply stood there, as if she'd already accepted whatever fate awaited her. "Bidding starts at $5, Cranston announced. "Now, before you get too excited, Let me be clear about what you're getting. She can't see to do regular household tasks, can't sew properly, can't tend fires without supervision, can't read or write beyond what they taught her in Braille. But she's docile, quiet, and the church swears she's never caused a lick of trouble. Marcus felt sick. The way they discussed her limitations as if she weren't standing right there, listening to every word. The casual cruelty of reducing a human being to a list of deficiencies. He'd seen cattle treated with more dignity. $5, called out a voice from the front of the crowd. Marcus craned his neck to see a thin man with yellowed teeth and clothes that hadn't been washed in weeks. But I want to inspect the merchandise first. Cranston nodded. Fair enough, Jeremiah. Step right.
Up.
The man climbed onto the platform and began circling the girl like a vulture. He grabbed her arm, examining it as if checking the muscle tone of a horse. She flinched but didn't pull away. When he reached for the cloth covering her eyes, she finally spoke. Please don't. Her voice was soft but carried clearly across the silent crowd. The light causes pain, even though I can't see it. Jeremiah paused, his hand hovering near the blindfold. For a moment, Marcus thought the man might show mercy. Instead, he laughed. Well, ain't that convenient? Blind girl who can't prove she's really blind. She's blind, all right, Cranston interjected quickly. Church has documentation, born with cataracts that never cleared, nothing false about it. $7, called another voice. This one belonged to a heavy-set man in a stained apron who reeked of the tannery district. Could use someone to sort hides. Don't need eyes for that, just hands. Marcus watched the girl's shoulders tense as the bidding continued. $8, $10, $12. Each increase felt like another nail in her coffin. These men weren't looking for a companion or even a servant. They were buying someone they could control completely, someone who would have no choice but to accept whatever treatment they decided to mete out. $15, shouted Jeremiah, his voice thick with anticipation. And I'll take her off your hands right now. The girl's head turned slightly toward the voice, and Marcus saw her lips pressed together in a thin line. For the first time since she'd appeared, she looked afraid. That's when Marcus noticed her hands. They were clenched at her sides, but there was something unusual about them. Even from his distance, he could see they were completely unmarked. No calluses, no scars, no signs of hard labor. In a world where everyone's hands told the story of their work, hers were smooth as polished stone. It struck him as oddly beautiful, especially when he looked down at his own gnarled, scarred fingers. The fire that had destroyed his ranch and killed his wife Sarah had left its mark on everything it touched. The burns on his hands had healed, poorly, leaving behind a network of raised scars that made simple tasks painful and fine motor work nearly impossible. He'd lost his ability to whittle, to write legibly, to play the guitar Sarah had loved to hear in the evenings. In a very real sense, he'd lost part of himself to those flames. But watching this girl stand there with such quiet dignity despite her circumstances, he felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought had died with Sarah. It wasn't a romantic attraction. She was far too young for that, and his heart belonged to his wife's memory. It was something else. Recognition, perhaps, the understanding that came from seeing someone else who'd been marked by forces beyond their control. $20, he heard himself say. The words came out louder than he'd intended, cutting through. The murmur of the crowd like a blade. Heads turned in his direction, and Marcus felt the weight of dozens of stares. He'd built a reputation in these parts over the past 3 years. The hermit rancher who lived alone in the burned-out shell of what had once been a thriving homestead. People knew his name, knew his story, and they generally left him alone. Cranston squinted in his direction. Marcus Thornfield, is that you? Well, I'll be damned. Thought you'd sworn off civilization entirely. 25, Jeremiah counted quickly, shooting a venomous look toward Marcus. Don't let some half-crazy recluse outbid decent folk. Marcus urged his stallion closer to the platform. The crowd parted before him, some out of respect, others out of unease. He'd always been a large man, made larger by years of hard physical labor, and his silence had a way of making people nervous. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. $50. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. $50 was more than most of these men made in a month. It was an absurd amount to pay, and for anyone, let alone a blind girl who couldn't perform traditional labor. The girl's head turned toward his voice, and even through the cloth covering her eyes, Marcus felt as if she were looking directly at him. There was something in her posture, a subtle straightening, as if she'd heard something in his tone that gave her hope. $50, Cranston repeated, his voice cracking slightly. Well, that's quite generous, Mr. Thornfield. Anyone care to match that bid? Silence. Jeremiah muttered something under his breath and spat in the dirt, but he didn't raise his hand. The tannery owner shook his head. Even the curious onlookers seemed stunned by the amount. Going once, Cranston called. Going twice. Wait, the girl said suddenly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the still air. Sir, if I may. Why? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. Marcus found himself looking at her hands again, so smooth and unmarked, and then at his own scarred palms wrapped around the leather reins. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than he'd intended. Because someone should choose kindness. She tilted her head slightly, processing his words. Then, for the first time since she'd appeared on that platform, she smiled. It was a small thing, barely more than a softening around her mouth, but it transformed her entire face. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sold, Cranston announced, bringing his gavel down with finality. $50 to Marcus Thornfield. As the crowd began to disperse, grumbling about the unexpected turn of events, Marcus dismounted and approached the platform. The girl was standing exactly where she'd been throughout the auction, but her posture had changed. She no longer looked like someone bracing for impact. Miss, he said quietly, my name is Marcus. I have a wagon here. Would you like me to help you down? She shook her head. I can manage, thank you, but... She paused, seeming to gather her courage. What happens now? It was a fair question, and Marcus wasn't entirely sure how to answer. He'd acted on impulse, moved by something he couldn't quite name. The practical considerations. Where she would sleep, what work she could do, how they would manage, hadn't occurred to him until now. Now we go home, he said simply, and we figure out the rest as we go. She nodded once, then carefully made her way to the edge of the platform. As she prepared to step down, she stumbled slightly on the uneven boards. Without thinking, Marcus reached out to steady her, his scarred hand catching her elbow. The moment their skin made contact, something extraordinary happened. A warmth spread from her arm into his hand, different from anything he'd ever experienced. It wasn't the heat of fever or fire, but something else entirely. Something that seemed to reach down into his very bones. The constant ache in his scarred fingers, present for 3 long years, simply stopped. She gasped softly, her head turning toward him with an expression of wonder. Your hands, she whispered. They've been in so much pain. Marcus stared down at his fingers, flexing them experimentally. The movement was smoother than it had been since the fire, the chronic stiffness gone. It lasted only a moment. As he released her arm, the pain returned, but the memory of that relief remained. How did you... He began, then stopped. Whatever had just happened defied explanation, and Marcus had learned not to question the few good things that came his way. She seemed to understand his confusion. "I don't know how it works," she admitted quietly. "I only know that sometimes, when I touch someone who's hurting, the pain eases for a while. The church called it a gift from God. Others called it witchcraft. And what do you call it?" She considered this for a moment. "I call it the only useful thing about me." The matter-of-fact way she said it broke something inside Marcus's chest. Here was a girl who'd been sold like livestock, who'd been reduced to her limitations and deficiencies, and she still somehow managed to see her unusual ability as a blessing rather than a curse. He offered her his arm, and this time when she took it, he was prepared for the warmth that spread between them. It wasn't just the physical relief, though that was remarkable enough. It was something deeper, a sense of connection he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. Together, they walked toward his wagon, leaving behind the dispersing crowd and the shameful scene at the courthouse. Marcus helped her up onto the bench seat, noticing how she immediately oriented herself by touch, finding the handholds and settling into position with practiced efficiency. As he climbed up beside her and gathered the reins, she spoke again. "Mr. Thornfield." "Marcus is fine." "Marcus, then, may I ask, what happened to your hands?" He was quiet for so long she might have thought he hadn't heard her. When he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "Fire, 3 years ago, burned down my ranch, took my wife and left me with these reminders. I'm sorry," she said simply. "Loss is heavy to carry alone." "What's your name?" he asked, wanting to change the subject before the memories became too sharp. "Grace," she replied. "Grace Whitmore." "Well, Grace Whitmore, I suppose we should head home and see what we can make of this arrangement." As the wagon began to move, carrying them away from Millbrook Valley and toward the remote homestead that had been Marcus's refuge from the world, neither of them spoke about the strange moment of healing they'd shared. But both felt it. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, they'd found something in each other that they hadn't even known they were looking for. The road ahead was long and uncertain. But for the first time in 3 years, Marcus Thornfield wasn't traveling it alone. And Grace Whitmore, who had spent her entire life being defined by what she couldn't do, was finally going somewhere she might discover what she could. The wagon wheels carved deep grooves through the muddy trail as they climbed steadily into the foothills beyond Millbrook Valley. Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap, her head tilted at an angle that Marcus was beginning to recognize. She was listening, cataloging sounds and scents to build a map of their surroundings. Every few minutes, she would ask a quiet question about what they were passing, and Marcus found himself describing the landscape in ways he hadn't thought about in years. "There's a stand of white oak to your left," he said as they rounded a bend. "Probably 40 years old, maybe more. The bark's gone silver with age, and the leaves are just starting to turn yellow at the edges." "I can smell them," Grace replied, inhaling deeply, sweet and earthy like honey mixed with rain. "Are there acorns on the ground?" Marcus glanced over, surprised by her specificity. "How did you know?" "The horses' hooves sound different when they step on them. Sharper, more brittle than just mud and stone." It was a reminder of how much he'd stopped noticing about the world around him. Since Sarah's death, he'd moved through his days like a man sleepwalking, focused only on the basic necessities of survival. But Grace's questions forced him to really see the countryside he'd traveled hundreds of times. The afternoon sun filtered through gathering clouds as they approached the turnoff to his property. Marcus hesitated at the fork in the road, suddenly aware of what Grace would be encountering. His homestead wasn't the thriving ranch it had once been. The main house was gone, reduced to a foundation of blackened stones and charred timbers he'd never found the heart to clear away. What remained was a hastily constructed cabin he'd built in the first desperate months after the fire, functional but stark, with none of the warmth that had once defined his home. "We're almost there," he said, his voice tighter than he'd intended. "Grace, turned toward him, and even through the cloth covering her eyes, he felt the weight of her attention. "You sound worried." "It's not." He paused, searching for the right words. "It's not much to look at. The place I'm taking you. I should have mentioned that earlier." "Mr. Thornfield Marcus," she corrected herself gently. "I've been living in a church basement for the past 2 years, sleeping on a cot next to the coal furnace. Before that, it was an orphanage with 30 other children crammed into rooms. Meant for half that number. I'm not looking for much to look at." Her matter-of-fact tone carried no self-pity, just simple honesty. Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, though he still dreaded the moment she would realize the full extent of his isolation. The cabin came into view as they crested the final hill, a squat, weathered structure with a stone chimney and a roof that needed patching, but it was the ruins beyond it that told the real story. The skeleton of what had once been a grand farmhouse stretched across a cleared area, its blackened bones stark against the green of the surrounding pastures. A stone well stood intact near the ruins, and the remains of a barn listed to one side. Like a ship taking on water, Marcus brought the wagon to a stop beside the cabin and set the brake. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken history. She paused in her exploration of the pantry shelves. "Then why did you bring me here?" "It's quiet here," Grace observed. "Peaceful. I can hear water running somewhere nearby." "There's a creek about 100 yards down the slope," Marcus said, grateful she'd noticed something positive. "It runs year-round, even in dry summers." He climbed down from the wagon and moved to help her, but she was already stepping down on her own, her movements careful but confident. She stood for a moment with her head tilted, absorbing the sounds and smells of her new surroundings. "The ruins," she said quietly. "That was your home. Where did it happen?" Marcus's hands tightened into fists. He'd grown accustomed to living with the constant reminder of his loss, but having someone else acknowledge it made the wound feel fresh again. "Yes. May I?" Grace hesitated, then extended her hand toward him. "May I touch your hands again? The pain is stronger now. I can feel it from here." Marcus looked at her outstretched palm, remembering the extraordinary relief he'd experienced earlier. The chronic ache in his scarred fingers had indeed intensified as they'd approached the homestead, as it always did when memories of the fire grew too vivid. "I don't understand how it works," he said, but he was already reaching for her hand. The moment their skin made contact, that strange warmth flowed between them again. The constant burning sensation that lived in his damaged nerve. Ending simply stopped, but this time something else happened. Images flashed through Marcus's mind, not his own memories, but something that felt like seeing through Grace's consciousness. He saw himself as she perceived him, a man carrying an enormous weight of grief, his entire being wrapped around a core of pain so deep it had become part of his identity. But beneath that pain, she sensed something else, kindness that had been buried but not destroyed, strength that had been tested but not broken. "You blame yourself," she said softly, her hand still resting in his. "But fires have their own will. They don't ask permission or choose their victims based on who deserves what." Marcus pulled his hand away, the pain rushing back like cold water. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" Grace's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath it. "I've been blamed for things beyond my control my entire life, told I was a burden, a punishment, a reminder of God's mysterious ways. People love to find reasons why terrible things happen, especially when those reasons let them believe they're safe from the same fate." Marcus stared at her, struck by the calm certainty in her voice. "The church told you that you were a punishment?" "Not in so many words, but they made it clear that my blindness was part of some greater plan, that my suffering served a purpose, The implication was always that if I just had enough faith, if I accepted my lot with enough grace, it would all make sense eventually. And do you believe that? Grace was quiet for a long moment, her head turned toward the sound of the distant creek. I believe in kindness, she said finally. I believe in the moment when someone chooses to help instead of harm, to include instead of exclude. Everything else is just people trying to make sense of chaos. Marcus found himself studying her profile, noting the way she held herself with such quiet dignity, despite everything she'd endured. There was something about her that reminded him of Sarah, though they looked nothing alike. It was the same unshakable core of compassion, the same refusal to let bitterness take root. "Come on," he said, hefting her small cloth bundle from the wagon. "Let me show you inside." The cabin's interior was as spare as its exterior, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Shelves lined one wall, holding basic supplies and a few treasured books that had survived the fire. The floor was packed earth, covered with a single braided rug Sarah had made during their first winter together. Grace stepped inside and immediately began her process of exploration, trailing her fingers along the walls, counting steps, building a mental map of the space. Marcus watched her work, fascinated by the methodical way she oriented herself. "It's larger than I expected," she said, running her hand along the edge of the table. "And you keep it clean. I can tell from the way sound. Carries no clutter, everything in its place. Habit, I suppose. Sarah always said a cluttered house meant a cluttered mind." "Sarah was your wife?" "Yes." The word came out rougher than he'd intended. Grace nodded, continuing her exploration. When she reached the bookshelf, she paused, her fingers tracing the spines. "You read?" "Used to. Haven't touched them much since." He gestured vaguely, though she couldn't see the motion. "Would you mind if I felt them? I can read Braille, but I like to touch regular books too. There's something about the weight of the pages, the texture of the binding." Marcus nodded, then remembered she couldn't see him. "Go ahead." Grace's fingers moved delicately over each volume, and Marcus found himself naming them for her. A collection of Emerson's essays, a volume of Shakespeare's plays, a farmer's almanac from 1887, and Sarah's favorite book of poetry. "Your wife had good taste," Grace observed, handling the poetry book with particular care. Tennyson, Browning, Whitman. She liked the romantics. How can you tell? The spine is more worn than the others. The pages fall open naturally to certain sections. She opened the book and inhaled gently. "And it smells like rosewater. She used to read it often." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "She did. Every evening after supper. Said poetry made the ordinary world feel magical." Grace closed the book carefully and replaced it on the shelf. "She sounds like she was someone special." She was. Marcus turned away, ostensibly to check the damper on the fireplace, but really to compose himself. "I should get a fire started. It gets cold here at night, even in summer." "Marcus." Grace's voice stopped him before he could reach for the kindling. "I'm not trying to replace her. I hope you know that." He turned back to find her standing in the center of the room, her hands clasped in front of her. The late afternoon light filtering through the single window cast her in gold, and for a moment she looked less like a lost soul and more like something approaching ethereal. "I know," he said quietly. "The thought never crossed my mind. It was only partially true. The thought hadn't crossed his mind, but something else had. A recognition that for the first time in 3 years, his cabin didn't feel quite so much like a tomb." As evening approached, they worked together to establish a routine. Marcus built up the fire while Grace explored the kitchen area, familiarizing herself with the location of dishes, utensils, and supplies. To his surprise, she proved remarkably capable despite her blindness, moving with the confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the world through touch and memory. "I can cook," she offered as Marcus contemplated their meager food stores. "Nothing fancy, but I can manage most basic meals. The church kitchen was where I was most useful." "You don't have to earn your keep, Grace. I didn't bring you here to be a servant." It was a fair question, and Marcus still wasn't sure how to answer. The impulse that had driven him to bid at the auction felt both crystal clear and completely mysterious. "Because leaving you there felt wrong," he said finally. "And because—" He hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Because when you touched my hands, something changed. I don't understand it, but I felt it." Grace turned toward him, her expression thoughtful. "The healing doesn't always work. Sometimes I touch someone and nothing happens at all. But with you, it was immediate, overwhelming even." "Has it ever been like that before?" "Once," she said quietly. "There was an old man at the orphanage, the night watchman. He had terrible arthritis in his joints, could barely climb the stairs. When I touched his hands, the pain went away for nearly an hour. But he was frightened by it, called me unnatural, said I was consorting with dark forces." "Do you think you—" Grace smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since the auction. "If healing pain is dark, then the world has its definitions backward." They prepared a simple meal together, beans and cornbread, basic fare that Marcus had been living on for months. But having someone to share it with transformed the experience entirely. Grace asked questions about the ranch, about the countryside, about his life before the fire. In return, she told him about her years at the orphanage, her time at the church, the small kindnesses that had sustained her through dark periods. "The minister's wife used to let me help in the garden," she said, as they cleaned up after supper. "She said I had a gift for knowing when plants needed attention, could tell by touch whether the soil was too dry or too wet, whether the leaves were healthy or diseased." "There's plenty of garden space here," Marcus said, "if you'd like to try again." "I'd like that very much." As night settled over the homestead, they sat by the fire, Grace in Sarah's old rocking chair and Marcus on a wooden stool he'd carved himself. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the crackling of logs and the distant sound of the creek. "Marcus," Grace said eventually, her voice soft in the firelight. "Thank you for choosing kindness today." Marcus looked at her, noting how the flames cast dancing shadows across her face, how peaceful she appeared despite everything she'd endured. "Thank you for letting me." It was a strange response, but Grace seemed to understand it. She nodded once, then settled deeper into the rocking chair, her head tilted back as if listening to something only she could hear. Outside, an owl called from the darkness, and Marcus realized that for the first time since Sarah's death, his cabin felt less like a place where dreams had gone to die, and more like a place where they might possibly begin again. The first week at the homestead passed in a series of small discoveries and careful adjustments. Grace had claimed the corner of the cabin near the window where she could feel the warmth of morning sunlight on her face and track the passage of time by the changing angle of the rays. Marcus had fashioned a makeshift privacy screen from an old quilt, giving her a sense of personal space within the single room. By the third day, she had memorized every inch of the cabin's interior and begun venturing outside. Marcus watched from a distance as she explored the yard, her hands trailing along fence posts and tree trunks, building a tactile map of her new world. She moved with increasing confidence, though she always returned to the cabin before the sun reached its peak, as if unwilling to venture too far from familiar ground. It was on the 7th morning that everything changed. Marcus had risen before dawn to check on the livestock in the makeshift shelter he'd built behind the cabin. 3 cows, a handful of chickens, and an old mule named Jasper comprised the remnants of what had once been a substantial operation. As he was filling the water trough, he heard an unfamiliar sound from the direction of the cabin. A voice, clear and melodious, rising and falling in a pattern he recognized but hadn't heard in years. Grace was singing. He froze with the bucket halfway to the trough, water splashing over his boots. The song was something he didn't recognize, possibly a hymn from her church days, but it was the quality of her voice that stopped him cold. It was pure and untrained, but naturally beautiful, with a clarity that seemed to make the very air around. The cabin shimmer. When the song ended, Marcus found himself walking back toward the cabin as if drawn by invisible threads. Grace was standing in the doorway, her face turned toward the sunrise she couldn't see, her expression peaceful in a way that made her look younger than her years. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Grace startled, her hand flying to her throat. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were listening. I'll be quieter." "No." Marcus's interruption came out sharper than he'd meant it to. "Don't apologize. Sarah used to sing in the mornings. I'd forgotten how much I missed it." Grace's expression softened. She had a beautiful voice? She thought she did. I never had the heart to tell her she was tone deaf. The words came out before Marcus could stop them, and for a moment he was horrified at the casual way he'd spoken about Sarah's flaws. But then Grace laughed, a genuine, delighted sound, and he felt something loosen in his chest. "I bet she made up for it with enthusiasm," Grace said. "Lord, yes. She'd sing while she worked, while she cooked, while she fed the chickens. Drove me half crazy sometimes, but the silence after..." He trailed off, surprised by how easily the words had come. "Would you like me to sing while I work?" Grace asked gently. "I promise I'll try to be less tone-deaf than Sarah." Marcus found himself smiling for the first time in recent memory. "I'd like that." And so a new rhythm established itself at the homestead. Grace would rise with the sun and begin her day with a song, her voice drifting across the valley as she went about. Her morning tasks. She had taken charge of the vegetable garden, or what remained of it after 3 years of neglect. Under her careful attention, the plot began to show signs of life. Marcus discovered that her claim about having a gift with plants had been modest understatement. She could indeed tell by touch whether soil was too dry or waterlogged, whether a plant was healthy or diseased. But more than that, she seemed to have an intuitive understanding of what each plant needed. Under her care, tomato vines that had been struggling for weeks suddenly burst into bloom. Herbs that Marcus had given up for dead began showing new growth. "How do you know?" he asked one afternoon, watching her gently probe the soil around a pepper plant with her fingertips. "I don't know exactly," Grace replied, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's like each plant has its own voice. This one is thirsty, but not desperately so. This one over here is getting too much water. The roots are starting to get soft and mushy." Marcus crouched beside her, looking at the plants she'd indicated. To his eye, they looked identical, but when he pressed his fingers into the soil, he could feel the difference. One slightly dry, the other waterlogged, just as she'd said. "Is it like the healing?" he asked. "The same kind of awareness?" Grace paused in her work, sitting back on her heels. "Similar, yes, but different too. With plants, it's about what they need to grow. With people..." She hesitated, then reached out and touched his wrist where it rested on his knee. The familiar warmth spread from her fingers into his arm, and once again the chronic ache in his scarred hands faded. But this time, Marcus was prepared for it, and he tried to understand what was happening. It wasn't just the absence of pain. It was as if her touch was reaching into the damaged tissue and reminding it how to function properly. With people, it's about healing what's been broken, Grace finished softly. Marcus flexed his fingers, marveling at the smooth movement that was usually accompanied by sharp jolts of pain. "How long have you been able to do this?" "Since I was very small, maybe 5 or 6 years old. One of the other children at the orphanage had broken her arm badly. The bone had healed wrong, and she was in constant pain. One day I touched her arm while she was crying, and the pain just stopped. What did the people at the orphanage say? Grace's expression darkened. They were frightened, called it unnatural, demonic. They separated me from the other children after that, made me sleep in a different room. That's when they started telling me I was being punished for some sin, that my blindness was God's way of balancing out whatever dark gift I'd been given. Marcus felt anger rise in his chest, hot and immediate. They were fools. Perhaps, but fear makes people cruel. I learned early not to let anyone know what I could do. The church in Riverside was the first place where anyone saw it as a gift rather than a curse. And yet they still sold you at auction. Grace's hand stilled on his wrist. They were kind to me for 2 years, fed me, clothed me, let me help in ways that made me feel useful. But kindness has limits when money runs short. Marcus covered her hand with his free one, feeling the strange double warmth of her healing touch and simple human contact. Not all kindness has limits. She looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. No. They remained, like that for several heartbeats, connected by touch and something deeper, until Grace gently pulled her hand away. The pain rushed back into Marcus's fingers, but somehow it felt less sharp than usual, as if her healing had left some residual effect. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Grace asked a question that had been weighing on Marcus's. "Mind as well, what will happen when people find out I'm here?" Marcus poked at the logs with an iron rod, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. He'd been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was inevitable. They'll talk. About what? About a man living alone with a young woman. About where you came from, why you're here. He paused, choosing his words carefully. About whether you're proper company for a respectable widower. Grace was quiet for a long moment. "Will it damage your reputation?" "I don't care much about my reputation, haven't for years. But you should care. A man needs to be able to trade in town, to do business with his neighbors. If I'm causing problems, Grace." Marcus's voice cut through her growing agitation. "I made my choice at that auction. I knew what the consequences might be. And I'd make the same choice again." She turned toward him, her expression vulnerable. In the firelight, why? It was the same question she'd asked at the auction, and Marcus still didn't have a complete answer. But he'd had time to think about it, time to understand the impulse that had driven him to bid $50 for a blind girl he'd never seen before. "Because," he said slowly, "for 3 years, I've been living like a dead man, going through the motions, surviving but not really living, and then you touched my hand, and for the first time since the fire, I remembered what it felt like to be whole." Grace's eyes widened behind the cloth covering them. "That's a heavy burden to place on someone." "I'm not asking you to heal me," Marcus said quickly. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm just saying that having you here reminds me that there's more to life than just enduring it." Before Grace could respond, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Marcus tensed, rising to look out the window. It was well past dark, an unusual time for visitors, especially at his isolated homestead. "Stay here," he said, reaching for the rifle he kept propped beside the door. "Who is it?" Grace asked, her voice tight with worry. "I don't know, but whoever it is, they're riding hard." Marcus stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but not raised. The rider was still a quarter-mile away, but the moonlight was bright enough to reveal a lone figure on horseback, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than menace. As the rider drew closer, Marcus recognized the horse, a distinctive white mare with black stockings that belonged to Dr. Samuel Hayes, the physician who served the scattered homesteads and small towns in the region. Marcus had met him twice, both times under grim circumstances related to Sarah's final illness. Dr. Hayes pulled up in front of the cabin, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious distress. He was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, but tonight he looked haggard. "Marcus," Dr. Hayes called out, breathless from his hard ride. "Thank God you're here. I need your help." "What's wrong?" "It's the Brennan family about 5 miles east of here. Little Emma Brennan. She's 8 years old. She was playing near the old mine shaft and fell in. They managed to get her out, but she's hurt bad. Broken bones, internal injuries. I've done what I can, but—" He shook his head grimly. "She's not going to make it through the night without a miracle." Marcus felt his blood chill. He knew the Brennan family by reputation. Good people, hard-working farmers with 5 children. Emma was the youngest, a bright-eyed girl with pigtails who sometimes waved from their wagon when they passed on the road to town. "What do you need from me?" Marcus asked. "I need to get her to the hospital in Riverside, but she can't survive the journey in her condition. I was hoping you might let me use your wagon. It's larger than mine, more stable, and perhaps you could help me get her there safely." Marcus was already nodding. "Of course. Let me hitch up the team." As he turned to go to the makeshift stable, Grace appeared in the doorway. "Marcus, what's happening?" Dr. Hayes looked at her with surprise, clearly not expecting to find a young woman at Marcus's homestead, but his urgency overrode his curiosity. "There's been an accident. A child is badly hurt." Grace stepped forward, her expression intent. "How badly?" "Miss, I appreciate your concern, but—" "Doctor," Grace interrupted gently, "may I ask what specific injuries the child has sustained?" Dr. Hayes looked between Grace and Marcus, confusion evident on his face. Several broken ribs, possible internal bleeding, a fractured skull. Without immediate surgery, she won't survive the night. Grace was quiet for a moment, her head tilted, as if listening to something only she could hear. Then she straightened, her expression resolute. "Take me with you." "Grace, no," Marcus said immediately. "It's too dangerous. The ride alone—" "Marcus." Grace turned toward him, her voice calm but determined. "That little girl is dying, and I might be able to help her." Dr. Hayes looked completely bewildered. "I'm sorry, miss, but I don't understand. Are you a nurse? Do you have medical training?" Grace shook her head. "No, doctor, but I have something else. Something that might give Emma Brennan the miracle you said she needs." Marcus understood immediately what Grace was proposing, and the thought terrified him. Her healing touch was remarkable when applied to his chronic pain. But this was different. This was life and death, a child's life hanging in the balance. "Grace, you don't know if it will work for something this serious. And if it doesn't work, if something goes wrong, then we'll be no worse off than we are now," Grace said simply. "But if I don't try, if I stay here safe while a child dies when I might have helped her—" She shook her head. "I couldn't live with that." Dr. Hayes was looking back and forth between them like a man trying to follow a conversation in a foreign language. "Would someone please explain to me what's going on?" Marcus looked at Grace, seeing the determination in every line of her posture. He knew that once she'd made up her mind about something, no force on earth could dissuade her, and deep down, he admired her for it, even as it scared him. "Doctor," he said finally, "this is Grace Whitmore, and she has what you might call a gift for healing." Dr. Hayes's eyebrows rose skeptically. "What kind of gift?" "The kind that might save Emma Brennan's life," Grace said quietly, "if you'll let me try." The three of them stood in the moonlight, urgency and uncertainty warring in the air between them. Somewhere to the east, a little girl lay dying, while her family waited for a miracle they had no reason to expect. Dr. Hayes looked at Grace for a long moment, taking in her youth, her blindness, the quiet confidence with which she'd made her extraordinary claim. Finally, he nodded. "If there's even a chance you can help that child," he said, "then we leave immediately." As Marcus rushed to prepare the wagon and Grace gathered her shawl, none of them spoke about the magnitude of what they were attempting. But all three understood that they were about to discover whether Grace's gift extended beyond easing chronic pain to something far more miraculous and far more dangerous. The ride to the Brennan homestead would be the first test of whether kindness, courage, and an inexplicable healing touch could overcome the harsh realities of a world where children fell down. Mine shafts and miracles were in desperately short supply. The wagon lurched violently as it hit another pothole in the rough mountain road, and Dr. Hayes gripped the side rail to keep from being thrown off the bench. Marcus drove with grim determination, pushing the horses harder than he normally would, while Grace sat between them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale in the moonlight. The journey to the Brennan homestead normally took an hour by wagon, but Marcus was cutting that time in half by taking the treacherous mountain path that most people avoided after dark. The narrow trail wound through dense forest and across rocky outcroppings, with steep drops on one side and sheer cliff faces on the other. "Tell me more about the child's injuries," Grace said to Dr. Hayes, her voice steady despite the wagon's violent motion. Dr. Hayes adjusted his medical bag to keep it from sliding off his lap. "The mine shaft is about 20 feet deep. She fell, head first, but there was some standing water at the bottom that probably saved her life. Her father managed to get down and bring her up, but by the time I arrived, she was unconscious. Breathing was shallow and irregular, pulse weak and thready." "Did she respond to any stimuli when you examined her?" The doctor looked at Grace with surprise. Her questions were more sophisticated than he'd expected from someone with no medical training. "Some response to pain, but sluggish. Her pupils were unequal, one dilated, one constricted. Classic signs of increased intracranial pressure," Grace nodded gravely. "And the internal injuries? Hard to determine without proper examination, but there's evidence of abdominal trauma, possible rupture of the spleen, maybe liver involvement. Without surgery within the next few hours." He left the sentence unfinished. Marcus felt Grace tense beside him. The severity of Emma's injuries was becoming clear, and he could sense her growing apprehension about what she was being asked to attempt. Her healing touch had worked wonderfully on his chronic pain and seemed to have remarkable effects on plants. But this was an entirely different magnitude of crisis. "Grace," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of hoofbeats and wagon wheels, "you don't have to do this. No one would blame you if—" "Yes, they would," Grace interrupted firmly, "and more importantly, I would blame myself." As they crested a ridge, the Brennan homestead came into view below, a modest farmhouse with warm yellow light spilling from every window. Even from a distance they could see people moving around in the yard, dark figures outlined against the lamplight. The scene had the frantic energy of a family in crisis. Marcus guided the wagon down the steep slope, and as they drew closer, the details of the scene became clearer. Thomas Brennan, a bear of a man with weathered hands and worried eyes, was pacing back and forth in front of the house. His wife, Catherine, sat on the porch steps, her face buried in her hands, while their 4 older children clustered around her in frightened silence. When they heard the wagon approaching, Thomas rushed forward, his expression desperate with hope. "Dr. Hayes, thank God you're back. She's gotten worse. Her breathing is even more labored, and she hasn't responded to anything for the past hour." Dr. Hayes was already climbing down from the wagon, his medical bag in hand. "I've brought help," he said, gesturing toward Marcus. "And Grace. Mr. Thornfield offered his wagon for the trip to Riverside, and Miss Whitmore, well, she may be able to provide additional assistance." Thomas looked at Grace with confusion, clearly wondering what assistance a blind young woman who could possibly provide in such dire circumstances. But desperation had a way of making people willing to grasp at any hope, no matter how unlikely. "Anything," Thomas said hoarsely. "If there's anything she can do. Anything at all." Grace stepped down from the wagon with Marcus's help, then straightened, her shoulders with visible determination. "Mr. Brennan, may I see Emma?" "See?" Thomas echoed, his confusion deepening as he noticed the cloth covering Grace's eyes. "Poor choice of words," Grace said with a slight smile. "May I examine her? I work differently than Dr. Hayes, but I might be able to help." Catherine Brennan looked up from the porch steps, her face streaked with tears. "You're just a girl yourself. What could you possibly—" "Catherine," Thomas said gently, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. "Let her try." The interior of the Brennan house was cramped but warm, filled with the comfortable clutter of a large family's daily life. But all of that had been pushed aside to make room for the makeshift sickbed where Emma lay. The little girl looked impossibly small and fragile against the white sheets, her blonde hair matted with dried blood from the head wound. Her breathing was indeed labored, with long pauses that made everyone in the room hold their breath until the next shallow intake. Dr. Hayes knelt beside the bed and began checking Emma's vital signs while Grace stood at the foot of the bed, her head tilted in that familiar listening posture. Marcus positioned himself near the door, ready to help but not wanting to crowd the small room. "Her pulse is weaker than before," Dr. Hayes murmured, his face grave. "We're running out of time." Grace moved slowly around the bed, her hands extended but not yet touching the child. Marcus watched her face, noting the intense concentration in her expression. It was as if she were listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. "There's so much pain," Grace whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "So much damage." "Can you help her?" Catherine asked desperately. Grace didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gently placed her hands on Emma's forehead, being careful to avoid the visible head wound. The moment her skin made contact with the child's, Grace gasped and nearly pulled away. "What is it?" Dr. Hayes asked sharply. "It's overwhelming," Grace said, her voice strained. "The pain is so intense, and there's damage everywhere. Internal bleeding, swelling in the brain, broken ribs that have punctured." She paused, taking a shuddering breath. "I can feel all of it." Marcus stepped forward, alarmed by the pallor that had come over Grace's face. "Grace, if it's too much—" "No," Grace said firmly, her hands remaining in contact with Emma's forehead. "She's fighting so hard to stay alive. I can feel her spirit still there, still strong. She doesn't want to give up." The room fell silent except for Emma's labored breathing. Grace closed her eyes behind the cloth covering them and seemed to sink deeper into whatever connection she was experiencing with the injured child. Marcus watched her face, seeing the play of emotions across her features: pain, concentration, determination, and something that looked almost like prayer. Minutes passed. Then gradually, something began to change. Emma's breathing became less labored, the pauses between breaths shorter. The unnatural pallor of her skin began to give way to a healthier color. Most remarkably, the swelling around her head wound. Visibly began to decrease. Dr. Hayes checked her pulse again, his eyes widening. "It's stronger, steadier. How is this possible?" Grace's hands were now glowing with a faint, warm light that seemed to emanate from her palms. The light pulsed gently, in rhythm with Emma's improving heartbeat. But Marcus could see the toll it was taking on Grace. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her breathing had become as labored as Emma's had been moments before. "The internal bleeding is slowing," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The pressure on her brain is decreasing, but there's so much to heal, and She swayed slightly, and Marcus stepped forward to steady her. "Grace, you need to rest." "No," Grace said urgently. "I'm not finished. The damage to her spleen, the fractured ribs. If I stop now, she could still die." Catherine Brennan was staring in wonder at her daughter, whose breathing had now normalized. Completely. "She's better. Look, she's actually better." Indeed, Emma's face had regained a healthy color, and the tension that had marked her features was fading. But Grace was clearly struggling, her entire body trembling with the effort of maintaining the healing connection. "I need to touch the other injuries," Grace said through gritted teeth. "The abdominal trauma." She moved her hands to Emma's side, where Dr. Hayes had detected the internal bleeding. The moment her palms made contact, the warm light intensified, and Grace cried out softly, as if she were experiencing the child's pain firsthand. Marcus could see that Grace was reaching the limits of her endurance. Her face was drawn and pale, her breathing rapid and shallow. Whatever she was doing to heal Emma was clearly taking a tremendous physical and emotional toll on her. "That's enough," Marcus said firmly, moving to pull Grace away from the bed. "You're going to hurt yourself." "Almost finished," Grace gasped. "The bleeding has stopped, but there's still swelling around the spleen. Just a few more minutes." Dr. Hayes was conducting his own examination of Emma, checking reflexes and vital signs. "This is extraordinary," he murmured. "Her pupils are equal and reactive now. Pulse is strong and regular. It's as if the injuries are actually healing themselves." Thomas and Catherine Brennan stood at the foot of the bed, holding each other and staring in amazement at their daughter's transformation. The other children had crept into the room and were watching with wide eyes as Grace continued her mysterious work. Finally, after what felt like hours, but had probably been only 20 minutes, Grace lifted her hands from Emma's body. The warm light faded, and Grace immediately collapsed backward into Marcus's waiting arms. "Grace!" Marcus supported her weight as she sagged against him, her face chalk white and her breathing shallow. But at that same moment, Emma Brennan's eyes fluttered open. "Mama?" the little girl said weakly, her voice small but clear. Catherine burst into tears and rushed to her daughter's side, gathering the child into a gentle embrace. "Emma! Oh, my sweet girl, you're all right." Emma looked around the room with confusion but alertness, clearly disoriented but obviously much improved. "What happened? Why does my head hurt?" Dr. Hayes conducted a quick examination, checking Emma's responses and looking for any remaining signs of serious injury. "Remarkable," he kept repeating. "Absolutely remarkable. There's some residual tenderness where the head wound was, but no signs of the severe trauma I documented earlier. The abdominal injuries seem to have healed completely." Marcus helped Grace to a chair in the corner of the room, alarmed by her continued weakness. "How do you feel?" "Tired," Grace admitted, her voice hoarse. "It's never been that intense before. The damage was so extensive and she's so young. Children's bodies fight differently than adults. But you did it," Marcus said softly. "You saved her life." Grace managed a weak smile. "We all did. Dr. Hayes's medical knowledge, your wagon to get here quickly, the family's love keeping her. Spirit strong. Healing isn't just about the physical touch, it's about all the factors coming together." The Brennan family was gathered around Emma's bed, tears of joy and relief flowing freely. Thomas approached Grace and Marcus, his eyes bright with gratitude and something approaching awe. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. What you did for our Emma, it's a miracle." "I was glad to help," Grace said simply. "But how?" Catherine asked, joining her husband. "How is such a thing possible?" Grace was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with how to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. "I believe we all have the capacity to heal," she said finally. "Most people just don't know how to access it. For some reason, I can channel that healing energy through touch." Dr. Hayes had been listening to this exchange while continuing to monitor Emma's condition. "Miss Whitmore," he said thoughtfully, "have you ever considered working with a physician? Your abilities, combined with proper medical knowledge, could help countless people. Grace looked startled by the suggestion. I don't know anything about medicine. You could learn, and in the meantime, there are so many people suffering from ailments that conventional medicine can't help. Chronic pain, degenerative conditions, injuries that won't heal properly. Marcus felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy or possessiveness. The thought of Grace leaving the homestead, of her sharing her gift with others, stirred emotions he wasn't prepared to examine too closely. That's something to consider for the future, he said carefully. Right now, Grace needs rest. Dr. Hayes nodded. Of course. But, Miss Whitmore, I hope you'll think about what I've said. What you did here tonight. It shouldn't be hidden away. As the evening wound down and Emma continued to show remarkable improvement, the doctor declared that the crisis had passed. There would be no need for the dangerous journey to Riverside. No desperate surgery performed under impossible conditions. Emma would recover fully, with nothing more than a small scar on her forehead to remind her of her brush with death. The ride back to Marcus's homestead was quiet, all three passengers lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. Grace dozed fitfully against Marcus's shoulder, exhausted by her healing efforts. Dr. Hayes rode in contemplative silence, clearly trying to reconcile what he had seen with his understanding of medical science. As they approached the cabin, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon. What had started as an emergency call in the middle of the night had turned into something that would fundamentally change how all of them understood the nature of healing and hope. Grace, Marcus said gently as they pulled up in front of the cabin. We're home. She stirred against his shoulder, blinking sleepily. Is Emma going to be all right? She's going to be fine, thanks to you. Grace straightened, seemingly gathering her strength for the walk to the cabin. No, she said firmly, thanks to all of us working together. That's how real healing happens. As Marcus helped her down from the wagon and they said their goodbyes, to Dr. Hayes, both of them understood that something fundamental had shifted. Grace's gift was no longer a private matter between the two of them. Word of what had happened at the Brennan homestead would spread, and with it would come new challenges, new opportunities, and new tests of their growing partnership. The sun was fully up by the time they entered the cabin, casting long golden rays through the single window. Grace sank into Sarah's old rocking chair with a sigh of exhaustion, while Marcus built up the fire and put water on for coffee. Are you sorry? Grace asked quietly. That Dr. Hayes knows about my abilities now? Marcus paused in his coffee preparation, considering the question carefully. No, he said finally. What you did tonight was too important to keep secret. Emma Brennan is alive because you were brave enough to risk everything to help her. But it changes things. People will know now. They'll come looking for me. Let them come, Marcus said with quiet determination. We'll face whatever happens together. Grace smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since before the emergency. Together, she repeated softly. I like the sound of that. Outside, the morning birds had begun their daily chorus, and smoke rose from the cabin's chimney into the clear mountain air. It was the beginning of a new day, and with it came the promise of new challenges and new possibilities for two people who had found in each other something neither had expected, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the extraordinary power of healing touch. 3 weeks after Emma Brennan's miraculous recovery, the first stranger appeared at Marcus's homestead. Grace was tending to her garden in the early morning light, her fingers gently probing the soil around a row of bean plants, when she heard the unfamiliar sound of multiple horses approaching from the east. She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands, and listened carefully to the rhythm of the hoofbeats, 3 horses, maybe 4, moving at a steady pace, rather than the urgent gallop that had marked Dr. Hayes's arrival weeks earlier. "Marcus," she called toward the barn, where he was repairing a broken harness. "We have visitors." Marcus emerged from the barn, his expression immediately wary. In the 3 years since Sarah's death, unexpected visitors had been rare and usually brought unwelcome news. But as the riders crested the hill and came into view, his wariness deepened into something approaching alarm. The lead rider was a woman in her 50s, dressed in expensive traveling clothes and riding a magnificent bay mare that spoke of considerable wealth. Behind her rode 2 men who had the bearing of hired protection, alert, well-armed, and clearly accustomed to potential trouble. The woman herself sat her horse with the confidence of someone used to commanding attention and getting her way. As the small party drew closer, Grace moved to stand beside Marcus, her hand instinctively finding his arm. The healing session with Emma had left her more sensitive to the emotions of others, and she could feel the tension radiating from these newcomers even at a distance. The woman dismounted gracefully and approached them with purpose, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the modest homestead. When she spoke, her voice carried the cultured accent of the eastern cities, marking her as someone far from home. "Mr. Thornfield, I presume," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I am Mrs. Victoria Ashworth of Boston. I believe you are harboring someone who may be of considerable interest to me." Marcus didn't take the offered hand, his posture radiating suspicion. "I'm not harboring anyone, Mrs. Ashworth. This is my property, and Miss Whitmore is here by her own choice." Mrs. Ashworth's gaze shifted to Grace, studying her with the calculating intensity of someone appraising valuable merchandise. "Ah, yes, Miss Whitmore, the miraculous healer. Word of your abilities has reached some very influential circles, my dear." Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, but I think you do." Mrs. Ashworth's smile was predatory. "The Brennan child's recovery has become quite the topic of conversation. Dr. Hayes, despite his attempts at discretion, couldn't help but share the extraordinary circumstances with some of his colleagues. And those colleagues have connections to people like myself, people who understand the value of rare talents." Marcus stepped slightly in front of Grace, his body language protective. "What exactly do you want, Mrs. Ashworth?" "I represent certain interests in Boston and New York. Wealthy families, prominent businessmen, influential politicians, people who suffer from ailments that conventional medicine cannot address." She paused, her gaze never leaving Grace. "And people who are willing to pay extraordinary sums for extraordinary cures." "I'm not for sale," Grace said quietly, but her voice carried steel. Mrs. Ashworth laughed, a sound like silver bells with a discordant edge. "My dear child, everything is for sale. It's simply a matter of finding the right price. I'm prepared to offer you accommodations in Boston, a salary of $500 per month, and the opportunity to help some of the most powerful people in America." Marcus felt Grace's hand tighten on his arm. $500 per month was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, enough to live in luxury beyond imagination. But he could feel the tension in Grace's grip, the way her breathing had become shallow and rapid. "And if I refuse?" Grace asked. Mrs. Ashworth's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "Why would you refuse such a generous offer? You're currently living in rustic conditions, with limited opportunities to use your gift for the greater good. In Boston, you could help hundreds of people, perhaps thousands. People who can afford to pay," Marcus said grimly. "Well, naturally. Charity is admirable, Mr. Thornfield, but it's hardly sustainable. Miss Whitmore's abilities are too valuable to waste on farmers and frontier families." Grace spoke before Marcus could respond. My abilities aren't for sale, Mrs. Ashworth. They're a gift, meant to help people who need healing, not to make wealthy people feel better about their indulgences. The temperature in Mrs. Ashworth's voice dropped several degrees. You're being naive, child. Gifts like yours don't go unnoticed for long. If you won't come willingly, there are other ways to ensure that your talents are properly utilized. Marcus's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle propped against the porch post. Are you threatening us? I'm simply stating facts. Miss Whitmore's existence has become a matter of public interest. There are questions about where she came from, how she was acquired, whether proper legal procedures were followed. Mrs. Ashworth's smile returned, shark-like in its coldness. The authorities might be very interested to learn about certain irregularities in recent transactions. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. She understood the implication. Mrs. Ashworth was threatening to expose the circumstances of her purchase at the auction, to paint Marcus as someone who had bought her for unsavory purposes. You're talking about lies and slander, Marcus said, his voice dangerously low. I'm talking about perception, Mr. Thornfield, and perception, particularly regarding the moral character of isolated men living with young women, can be very difficult to overcome. The two hired men had remained mounted but alert throughout this exchange, their hands resting casually near their weapons. Grace could sense their readiness for violence, the way they watched Marcus for any sign of aggressive movement. I need time to consider your offer, Grace said carefully, her mind racing as she tried to find a way out of this trap. Mrs. Ashworth nodded graciously, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. Of course, my dear. Take all the time you need. We'll be staying at the hotel in Millbrook Valley for the next week. After that, she shrugged elegantly. Well, after that, the situation may become more complicated. As quickly as they had arrived, the three riders departed, leaving Marcus and Grace standing in the yard, with the morning suddenly feeling much less peaceful. Grace sank onto the porch steps, her hands trembling as the full implications of the encounter settled over her. She means it, Grace said quietly, about making trouble for you. Women like that have connections, influence. They can destroy reputations with a few well-placed words. Marcus sat beside her, his jaw tight with anger. Let her try. I've survived worse than gossip. Have you? Marcus, think about what she's suggesting. A man living alone with a young woman he bought at an auction. In the wrong light, it looks... She couldn't finish the sentence. It looks like exactly what it is. A man who chose kindness over cruelty. Anyone who knows me would never believe otherwise. But how many people really know you? You've been isolated for 3 years. And Mrs. Ashworth is right about one thing. Perception can be more powerful than truth. They sat in silence for several minutes, both grappling with the sudden transformation of their peaceful existence into something fraught with danger and difficult choices. There's something else, Grace said eventually. She's not the only one. Who will come? Word is spreading about what happened with Emma, and there will be others. Some will offer money, some will make threats, some will simply show up expecting miracles. Marcus had been dreading this conversation since the night at the Brennan homestead. He'd seen the wonder in Dr. Hayes's eyes, heard the awe in the Brennan family's voices, and known that their secret was no longer secret. What do you want to do? He asked. Grace was quiet for a long time, her head tilted toward the sound of the creek in the distance. When she finally spoke, her voice was heavy with reluctant decision. I think we need to leave. Marcus felt his heart sink. Leave? This is your home now. No, Marcus, this is your home, your sanctuary. I've brought danger to it, and that's not fair to you. She turned toward him, her expression resolute despite the pain he could hear in her voice. If I go with Mrs. Ashworth or someone like her, at least you'll be safe. Absolutely not. Marcus's response was immediate and vehement. I won't let you sacrifice yourself to protect me. Then what do you suggest? We can't fight people like Mrs. Ashworth. She has money, influence, probably legal connections, and she's just the first. There will be others, and some of them won't be content to make polite threats. Marcus stood and began pacing across the porch, his mind working furiously. Grace was right about the impossibility of their situation, but he refused to accept that their only options were submission or separation. There might be another way, he said slowly. What do you mean? Dr. Hayes mentioned something the night we helped Emma, about you working with a physician, using your abilities to help people who really need it. Grace frowned. You want me to leave anyway, to go work with Dr. Hayes? Not exactly. Marcus stopped pacing and faced her. What if we both left, not to work for someone else, but to start something new, something on our own terms? I don't understand. Marcus sat back down beside her, his voice gaining strength. As the idea took shape, think about it, Grace. There are towns throughout this territory where good medical care is scarce or non-existent. Places where people suffer because they can't afford a doctor, or because conventional medicine can't help them. What if we traveled to those places? Grace's expression was skeptical. Just the two of us, moving from town to town. You with your healing gift, me providing protection and practical support. We could help people who really need it, stay ahead of people like Mrs. Ashworth, and... He paused, surprised by the sudden clarity of his own feelings. And we could stay together. The last words hung in the air between them, charged with implications neither had been ready to acknowledge until now. Grace turned toward Marcus, her expression softening. You'd give up your home for me? Your safety? Your privacy? Grace, this place stopped being a home 3 years ago. It became a tomb, a place where I came to hide from the world. But with you here... He reached out and took her hand, feeling the familiar warmth of her touch. With you here, it started feeling like a home again, not because of the place, but because of the person. Grace's eyes filled with tears behind the cloth covering them. Marcus, I care about you too, more than I probably should, but what kind of life would that be? Always running, always looking over our shoulders? A life where we choose our own purpose, Marcus said firmly, where your gift is used to help people who really need it. Not to make rich people richer, where we're partners, equals, working together. Before Grace could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached them again. But this time, it was just one rider, and Grace recognized the familiar gait of Dr. Hayes's white mare. Dr. Hayes dismounted quickly, his expression grave. Marcus, Grace, thank God you're both here. I came as soon as I heard. Heard what? Marcus asked, about Mrs. Ashworth's visit. Word travels fast in small communities, and someone saw her heading this way with her hired men. Dr. Hayes looked between them anxiously. I know why she's here, and I know what she's probably offered you. And, Grace asked quietly, and I want to make you a counter-offer. Dr. Hayes straightened, his expression earnest. Not to work for me, but to work with me, as partners. Marcus felt a stab of jealousy, but Dr. Hayes continued before he could object. All three of us, the doctor clarified. Marcus, you have skills that would be invaluable. You know the country, you can handle yourself in difficult situations, and you understand Grace's abilities better than anyone. Grace, your gift combined with medical knowledge could revolutionize how we treat illness and injury. What exactly are you proposing? Grace asked. A traveling medical practice. We could establish a circuit through the territory, visiting communities that rarely see a doctor. I could provide the medical training and supplies. You could provide the healing that goes beyond conventional medicine. And Marcus could provide security and practical support. Grace and Marcus exchanged glances, both recognizing the similarity between Dr. Hayes's proposal and the idea Marcus had just suggested. It would be legitimate, Dr. Hayes continued, respected, and most importantly, it would be focused on helping people who truly need it, not catering to the whims of the wealthy. And Mrs. Ashworth, Marcus asked, would have no legal grounds. to interfere with a legitimate medical practice, particularly one endorsed by established physicians and territorial authorities. Grace was quiet for several minutes, considering both proposals. Finally, she spoke. "Dr. Hayes, would Marcus and I have equal say in how we operate? Who do we help and how do we help them?" "Absolutely. This would be a true partnership." Grace turned toward Marcus. "What do you think?" Marcus looked at her, seeing the hope beginning to kindle in her expression. The idea of working with Dr. Hayes wasn't exactly what he'd envisioned, but it offered something their partnership alone couldn't: legitimacy and protection from people like Mrs. Ashworth. "I think," he said slowly, "that it sounds like exactly what we've been looking for." Grace smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since Mrs. Ashworth's threatening visit. "Then let's do it. Let's find a way to use this gift properly." Dr. Hayes grinned with relief. "Excellent. I'll begin making arrangements immediately. We'll need supplies, legal documentation, letters of introduction to various communities." As the three of them began discussing the practical details of their new venture, Grace felt a sense of rightness settle over her. For the first time since her abilities had manifested, she would be able to use them without shame, without hiding, without fear of exploitation. And more importantly, she would be doing it alongside Marcus, not as his ward or his burden, but as his partner in every sense of the word. The sun was reaching its zenith as they planned their new future, but Grace could already sense that the most challenging part of their journey was still ahead. Mrs. Ashworth would not accept defeat gracefully, and there would be others like her. But for the first time since the auction in Millbrook Valley, Grace felt ready to face whatever came next. She was no longer a blind girl waiting to be rescued. She was a healer, a partner, and a woman choosing her own destiny. And that, she thought, made all the difference in the world. The transformed wagon rolled into the dusty town of Cedar Falls on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, its modified design drawing curious stares from the handful of people moving along the main street. Dr. Hayes had worked with a skilled carpenter in Riverside to convert a sturdy freight wagon into a mobile medical clinic. Canvas sides could be rolled down for privacy during examinations, while specially built compartments held medical supplies, Grace's healing herbs, and camping equipment for their travels between settlements. It had been 6 weeks since they'd left Marcus's homestead, 6 weeks of establishing their circuit through the remote communities of the territory. Word of their unusual practice had spread faster than they'd anticipated. A legitimate doctor, traveling with a gifted healer and a capable guardian, offering medical care to places that rarely saw professional help. Grace sat beside Marcus on the driver's bench, her face turned toward the sounds of the small community ahead. Cedar Falls was their 8th stop, a mining town nestled in a narrow valley where the constant sound of pickaxes against stone created a rhythmic backdrop to daily life. The smell of wood smoke, coal dust, and unwashed bodies told the story of a hard-working population living in difficult conditions. "How many people do you think?" Grace asked quietly, her enhanced senses already picking up the subtle indicators of the town's size and mood. Marcus guided the horses toward what appeared to be the town's center, where a general store and saloon faced each other across a rutted dirt road. Maybe 200 souls, give or take. Mining camp that's been here long enough to put down some roots. Dr. Hayes emerged from the wagon's interior, having been organizing supplies during their approach. Perfect size for our purposes. Large, enough to need medical attention. Small enough that we can make a real difference in a few days. Their arrival had not gone unnoticed. Men emerging from the mine shaft at the end of their shifts paused to stare at the unusual wagon. Women hanging laundry behind modest cabins craned their necks to get a better look. Children playing in the dusty street stopped their games to follow the wagon's progress with wide eyes. Marcus brought the wagon to a halt in front of the general store, where a hand-painted sign declared, "Morrison's Goods, fair prices, honest dealing." Before they could even begin unhitching the horses, a man emerged from the store. Tall, lean, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years working in harsh conditions. "You folks lost?" the man asked, his tone cautious but not unfriendly. "Don't get many travelers through Cedar Falls, especially ones with rigs like that." Dr. Hayes stepped forward, extending his hand in greeting. "James Morrison, I presume. I'm Dr. Samuel Hayes. These are my colleagues, Mr. Marcus Thornfield and Miss Grace Whitmore. We're traveling physicians, offering medical services to communities that might not otherwise have access to professional care." Morrison's expression shifted from suspicion to interest. "Physicians? Well, I'll be damned. We haven't seen a real doctor here must be going on 3 years now. Old Doc Brennan used to come through regular, but he passed on, and no one's taken up his route." "That's exactly why we're here," Grace said, climbing down from the wagon with Marcus's assistance. "We understand the challenges of frontier medical care." Morrison looked at Grace with curiosity, noting her youth and the cloth covering her eyes. "Begging your pardon, miss, but you're a physician too?" "Miss Whitmore has specialized training in healing techniques that complement traditional medicine," Dr. Hayes explained diplomatically. "They'd developed this explanation over their weeks of travel, finding it more acceptable to frontier communities than trying to explain Grace's supernatural abilities up front. Well, specialized or not, we could use all the help we can get," Morrison said grimly. "Been a run of bad luck lately. Cave-in 2 weeks ago left 3 men hurt, and they're not healing up like they should. Plus, there's been fever going through the children, and old Mrs. Patterson's been laid up with something in her joints that keeps her from getting out of bed." Grace felt the familiar stirring of purpose that came with learning about people in need. Over their weeks of travel, she'd discovered that using her gift in service to others gave her a sense of fulfillment she'd never experienced before. Each person healed, each life improved, felt like a step toward justifying the extraordinary abilities she'd been given. "Where would be the best place for us to set up?" Marcus asked, already scanning the town for a suitable location. "Church Hall's probably your best bet," Morrison replied. "Father McKenna's been expecting someone like you folks eventually. Said it was only a matter of time before word got out about the unusual healing that's been happening in these parts." Grace and Marcus exchanged glances. They'd been careful to keep Grace's more dramatic abilities discreet, but news traveled even in remote areas, and some stories inevitably grew in the telling. "Father McKenna sounds like a wise man," Dr. Hayes said carefully. "We'd be honored to work with the local clergy." As they began the process of relocating their mobile clinic to the church grounds, Grace became aware of being watched. Not the casual curiosity they'd encountered in other towns, but something more intense, more focused. She mentioned it quietly to Marcus as they unloaded supplies. "I feel it too," Marcus replied, his voice low. "Someone's taking more than polite interest in our arrival." Their setup at the small wooden church proceeded smoothly, with Father McKenna, round, jovial man in his 60s, proving enthusiastically supportive of their mission. By evening, word had spread throughout Cedar Falls, and a line of people seeking medical attention had formed outside the church hall. The first patients were straightforward cases that Dr. Hayes could handle with conventional medicine. Minor injuries, common illnesses, preventive care that had been neglected due to lack of access to professional treatment. Grace assisted with examinations and preparations, her sensitive touch allowing her to detect problems that might not be immediately obvious to conventional examination. It was near midnight when the serious cases began arriving. The first was Tommy Kowalski, a miner in his 30s who'd been caught in the cave-in Morrison had mentioned. His left leg had been crushed by falling rocks, and despite the local folk remedies that had been applied, infection had set in. The leg was swollen, discolored, and gave off the sickly sweet smell that spoke of tissue death. Dr. Hayes examined the injury by lamplight, his expression growing increasingly grave. "This should have been treated immediately," he murmured to Grace and Marcus. "The infection is well established. In a proper hospital, amputation might be the only option to save his life." Grace knelt beside the makeshift examination table, her hands hovering over Tommy's injured leg. She could feel the infection like a dark, hot presence spreading through the damaged tissue. But beneath that, she sensed something else. Healthy. Tissue fighting against the corruption. Tommy's own body struggling to heal itself, if given the chance. "May I try?" she asked Dr. Hayes quietly. He nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. In their weeks of working together, Grace's healing touch had proven remarkably effective for chronic conditions and minor injuries. But this level of severe trauma was beyond anything they'd attempted. Grace placed her hands gently on Tommy's leg, being careful to avoid the worst of the damaged area. The moment her skin made contact, she gasped at the intensity of pain and corruption she encountered. The infection was worse than Dr. Hayes had realized, spreading toward vital areas that would soon threaten Tommy's life. But as Grace deepened her concentration, something extraordinary began to happen. The warm, healing light that had become familiar during their travels intensified, pulsing with a rhythm that matched Tommy's heartbeat. Under her touch, the swelling began to decrease visibly. The angry red coloration of infection started to fade, replaced by healthier pink tones. Tommy, who had been barely conscious from pain and fever, suddenly opened his eyes wide. "The pain," he whispered in amazement. "It's going away." Dr. Hayes monitored Tommy's vital signs as Grace worked, watching in fascination as the young man's fever broke and his pulse strengthened. The infected tissue was healing at a rate that defied medical explanation, healthy flesh replacing corrupted areas before their eyes. "Incredible," Dr. Hayes murmured. "The cellular regeneration is happening in real time. I've never seen anything like it." Grace maintained her healing touch for nearly an hour, pouring her energy into Tommy's recovery. By the time she finally lifted her hands, exhausted but triumphant, his leg appeared completely normal. No sign of infection, no evidence of the devastating injury that had threatened his life just hours before. Tommy sat up on the examination table, flexing his leg in wonder. "I can't believe it. I was sure they were going to have to cut it off. How is this possible?" "Miss Whitmore has a remarkable gift," Dr. Hayes said simply, "one that we're still learning to understand ourselves." Word of Tommy's miraculous recovery spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. By morning, a crowd had gathered outside the church, and people were arriving from neighboring mining camps and settlements. Some came seeking healing for themselves or family members. Others simply curious to witness what they'd heard was impossible. Grace found herself facing the most challenging day of her healing career. Patient after patient presented conditions that conventional medicine could address only partially or not at all. A child born with a twisted spine, an elderly woman whose arthritis had left her completely bedridden, a young man whose lungs had been damaged by years of breathing coal dust. Each healing session drained Grace's energy, but each success filled her with a sense of purpose that made the exhaustion worthwhile. Marcus stayed close throughout the day, monitoring her condition and insisting on breaks when she pushed herself too hard. Dr. Hayes documented each case meticulously, as fascinated by the medical implications as he was committed to helping the patients. It was late afternoon when the observer Grace had sensed the previous day finally revealed himself. Marshal William Crawford was a man in his 50s, with steel-grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He'd been watching their work from various vantage points throughout the day, taking careful note of each patient and each remarkable recovery. "Dr. Hayes," Marshal Crawford said, approaching their makeshift clinic as they treated their final patient of the day. "I need a word with you and your associates." Dr. Hayes looked up from the medical supplies he was organizing. "Of course, Marshal. How can we help you?" "It's more a matter of how I can help you," Crawford replied, his expression serious. "I've been observing your work here, and I have to say, what I've witnessed is extraordinary." Grace felt a familiar chill of apprehension. In their weeks of travel, they'd encountered various reactions to her healing abilities: wonder, gratitude, fear, and occasionally suspicion. Marshal Crawford's tone suggested the latter. "We're simply providing medical and care to people who need it," Marcus said carefully. "Oh, I don't doubt your intentions," Crawford replied, "but I think you should know that word of your activities has reached some very interested parties with considerably more resources and influence than the good people of Cedar Falls." "Doctor," Hayes set down the medical instrument he'd been cleaning. "What exactly are you saying, Marshal?" "I'm saying that Mrs. Victoria Ashworth has been making inquiries, official inquiries, backed by some very powerful people in the territorial government. She's claiming that Miss Whitmore here is practicing medicine without proper credentials, possibly endangering public health with unproven treatments." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Despite their precautions, despite their legitimate partnership with Dr. Hayes, Mrs. Ashworth had found a way to pursue them. "Miss Whitmore works under my supervision as part of a legitimate medical practice," Dr. Hayes said firmly. "I have all the necessary credentials and documentation." "I'm sure you do, Doctor. But Mrs. Ashworth has raised questions about the nature of Miss Whitmore's treatments. She's suggesting that what's being practiced here isn't medicine at all, but some form of, shall we say, supernatural manipulation." Marcus stepped forward, his posture protective. "Are you here to arrest us, Marshal?" "No, Mr. Thornfield. I'm here to warn you." Crawford's expression softened slightly. "I've seen what Miss Whitmore can do. I watched her heal Tommy Kowalski's leg, watched her give that child with the twisted spine a chance at a normal life. What you're doing here is good work, important work." "Then why the warning?" Grace asked. "Because Mrs. Ashworth isn't going to give up. She has connections in territorial government, federal law enforcement, even some church authorities. She's building a case that you're operating outside legal medical practice, potentially using fraudulent or even occult methods to deceive vulnerable people." Dr. Hayes frowned. "That's absurd. Every treatment has been documented. Every patient has given informed consent, and the results speak for themselves." "The results are exactly what worry Mrs. Ashworth," Crawford replied. "She can't buy what Miss Whitmore refuses to sell, so she's trying to control it through legal means." Grace sat down heavily on a wooden crate, feeling the weight of inevitability settling over her. No matter how far they traveled, no matter how much good they did, people like Mrs. Ashworth would always find ways to pursue what they wanted. "What do you suggest we do?" Marcus asked. "Keep moving, for now. Avoid the larger towns where territorial authorities have more presence. Stick to places like Cedar Falls, where local people can testify to the good you're doing." Crawford paused, his expression troubled. "But I won't lie to you, this is bigger than just Mrs. Ashworth now. Word of Miss Whitmore's abilities has reached Washington. There are people in the federal government who see potential military applications for supernatural healing abilities." The three partners exchanged alarmed glances. The idea of Grace's gift being used for military purposes was horrifying to contemplate. "How long do we have?" Dr. Hayes asked. "Hard to say. Could be weeks, could be months, but eventually they'll come with enough legal authority that local marshals like me won't be able to protect you." As Marshal Crawford departed, leaving them to contemplate this new level of threat, Grace felt a strange mixture of despair and determination. The work they were doing mattered. She'd seen it in Tommy Kowalski's healed leg, in the twisted child's straightened spine, in the grateful faces of people who'd given up hope. "We keep going," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. Marcus looked at her with surprise. "Grace, you heard what he said. They'll never stop pursuing you." "Then we make every day count," Grace replied. "Every person we help, every life. We improve. That's something they can't take away, no matter what legal authority they think they have." Dr. Hayes nodded slowly. "She's right. We knew this work would be dangerous when we started. But the good we're doing is too important to abandon because of threats." As evening fell over Cedar Falls, and they prepared for another night of rest before moving on to their next destination, Grace felt a new sense of resolve settling over her. She was no longer the frightened girl who'd stood on an auction block, waiting for someone to determine her fate. She was a healer, a partner, and a woman who'd found her purpose. And that purpose was worth fighting for, no matter who tried to stand in her way. The road ahead would be more dangerous than ever, but Grace was ready to face whatever challenges awaited. She had Marcus beside her, Dr. Hayes as their ally, and, most importantly, she had the unshakable knowledge that her gift was making a real difference in the world. That knowledge, she thought, might be the most powerful protection of all. The autumn morning air carried the scent of turning leaves and wood smoke as their wagon crested the final hill overlooking Redemption Springs, a frontier town nestled in a valley where natural hot springs had drawn settlers seeking both physical healing and spiritual renewal. It was their 15th stop in 4 months of constant travel, and Grace could sense something different about this place even before she could hear the sounds of the community below. "It's larger than our usual stops," Marcus observed, guiding the horses down the winding trail. "Maybe 800 people, possibly more." Dr. Hayes emerged from the wagon's interior, his medical journals in hand. Over their months of partnership, he documented dozens of remarkable healings, creating an unprecedented record of Grace's abilities and their medical applications. Redemption Springs has a reputation as a place where people come seeking cures. "If we're going to make a stand anywhere, this might be the right place," Grace nodded, understanding the implication. Marshal Crawford's warnings had proven accurate. Their pursuers were closing in. 3 times in the past month, they'd arrived in towns to find federal marshals asking questions about their activities. Mrs. Ashworth's influence had grown, backed by powerful interests who saw Grace's abilities as either a valuable asset to be controlled or a dangerous deception to be stopped. But Redemption Springs was different. Word had reached them through their network of contacts that this community had officially petitioned the territorial government for the right to establish their own medical sanctuary, a place where unconventional healing practices could be pursued without interference. It was a bold legal strategy that might provide the protection they desperately needed. As they entered the town proper, Grace was struck by the diversity of people moving through the streets. Unlike the homogeneous farming and mining communities they'd been serving, Redemption Springs drew visitors from across the territory and beyond. She could hear multiple languages being spoken, smell the distinctive foods of various cultures, and sense the hopeful desperation that marked people who'd traveled far in search of healing. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of an impressive 2-story building with a sign reading Healing Arts Institute, All Seekers Welcome. A woman emerged from the building's entrance, tall, graceful, with prematurely silver hair and eyes that radiated both intelligence and compassion. "Dr. Hayes," the woman called out. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez. We've been corresponding about your visit." Dr. Hayes climbed down from the wagon with obvious relief. Dr. Vasquez was a physician who'd established the institute after her own experiences with healing practices that went beyond conventional medicine. Her letters had spoken of a safe haven where Grace's abilities could be studied, documented, and practiced without persecution. "Dr. Vasquez, it's an honor to finally meet you in person," Dr. Hayes replied, shaking hands warmly. "May I present my partners, Mr. Marcus Thornfield and Miss Grace Whitmore." Dr. Vasquez approached Grace with the careful respect she'd learned to appreciate from medical professionals who understood the legitimacy of her gift. "Miss Whitmore, your reputation precedes you. The documented results of your healing work have created quite a stir in progressive medical circles. Good stir or bad stir?" Grace asked with a slight smile. "Both, I'm afraid. But here at Redemption Springs, we believe that true healing encompasses more than conventional medicine acknowledges." Dr. Vasquez gestured toward the Institute building. "We've prepared facilities where you can work without constraint, and where we can properly document and study your methods." As they toured the Institute, Grace felt a sense of homecoming she hadn't experienced since leaving Marcus's cabin months ago. The building housed not just medical facilities, but also research libraries, consultation rooms, and living quarters for visiting practitioners. Most importantly, it was designed around the principle that healing could take many forms, all of them deserving respect and study. "The legal situation?" Marcus asked as they settled into Dr. Vasquez's office. "Complex but manageable," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Redemption Springs has been granted special territorial status as a medical research community. Within these boundaries, we have significant autonomy to practice and study healing arts that might be restricted elsewhere." Dr. Hayes leaned forward with interest. "How much autonomy?" "Enough to protect Miss Whitmore from the federal authorities, who've been pursuing you, provided her work here is conducted under proper medical supervision and documentation." Dr. Vasquez looked directly at Grace. "What we're offering is the opportunity to use your gift openly, to help as many people as possible, while building the scientific foundation that might eventually lead to broader acceptance." Grace felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. The offer was everything they'd been working toward: legitimacy, protection, and the chance to help people on a scale they'd never imagined. But something in Dr. Vasquez's manner suggested there were complications she hadn't yet mentioned. "What's the catch?" Grace asked directly. Dr. Vasquez smiled at her perceptiveness. "The catch is that Mrs. Ashworth and her allies haven't given up. They're challenging our territorial status in federal court, claiming that we're harboring fraudulent medical practices and endangering public safety. We have perhaps 6 months before the legal challenges reach a point where even our special status might not protect us." "6 months," Marcus repeated grimly. "And then we'll need to have built such a strong case for the legitimacy and value of Miss Whitmore's abilities that federal authorities will have no choice but to acknowledge them." Dr. Vasquez turned to Grace again. "That means helping as many people as possible, documenting every success, and building a network of testimonials that can't be dismissed or suppressed." Grace was quiet for several minutes, weighing the opportunity against the risks. In 6 months, she could potentially help hundreds of people, maybe thousands. But if they failed to build sufficient legal protection, she could find herself facing federal custody and forced conscription into military service. "I want to see the facilities," Grace said finally, "and I want to meet some of the patients." The tour that followed exceeded Grace's most optimistic expectations. The Institute housed people suffering from every imaginable condition, veterans of frontier conflicts bearing both physical and emotional scars, children with birth defects that conventional medicine couldn't address, elderly individuals facing degenerative diseases that robbed them of dignity and independence. But what impressed Grace most was the atmosphere of hope that permeated the facility. Unlike the charity hospital she'd heard described, where the poor went to die, the institute felt like a place where people came to live again. "The first patients are waiting," Dr. Vasquez said as they completed their tour. "But I want to be clear about something. We're not asking you to exhaust yourself trying to help everyone. Sustainable healing practice means understanding your limits." Grace nodded, appreciating the concern. Over their months of travel, she'd learned to pace herself, to recognize when her gift was approaching its limits. But she'd also discovered that her abilities seemed to grow stronger with use, as if the act of healing itself was healing something within her. The first patient was Maria Santos, a young mother who'd been injured in a farming accident that had left her partially paralyzed. Conventional medicine had done what it could, but Maria remained confined to a wheelchair with limited sensation in her legs. Grace sat beside Maria's wheelchair, her hands resting gently on the young woman's knees. The familiar warmth of her healing touch began to flow, but this time it felt different, stronger, more focused than ever before. The months of constant practice had refined her abilities, allowing her to direct her gift with unprecedented precision. "I can feel it," Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can feel your hands. I can feel my legs." Over the course of an hour, feeling gradually returned to Maria's lower extremities. It wasn't a complete cure. The nerve damage was too extensive for that, but it was enough to allow her to stand, to take tentative steps, to envision a future where she could chase her children through the fields again. Dr. Vasquez documented every detail of the healing session, her excitement barely contained as she witnessed the kind of recovery that medical textbooks declared impossible. The second patient was Benjamin Carter, a former soldier whose experiences in territorial conflicts had left him unable to sleep, unable to find peace, unable to function in civilian life. This was territory Grace had never explored, emotional and psychological trauma that existed beyond the reach of physical healing. When Grace placed her hands on Benjamin's shoulders, she felt something different from the physical ailments she usually encountered. Instead of damaged tissue or disrupted function, she sensed a deep spiritual wound, a fracture in the man's very sense of self. The healing that followed was unlike anything Grace had experienced. Instead of the warm physical sensation she associated with mending bones and tissue, she felt herself pouring something else into Benjamin: peace, hope, the simple but profound knowledge that he was worthy of healing and happiness. Benjamin's transformation was immediate and dramatic. The haunted expression that had marked his features disappeared, replaced by a clarity and calm that left Dr. Vasquez speechless. For the first time in months, Benjamin smiled, genuinely, completely, like a man who'd remembered what joy felt. "Like how?" Dr. Vasquez asked Grace afterward. "How did you know to approach psychological trauma differently from physical injury?" Grace shook her head, still processing what had happened. "I didn't know. I just followed what felt right. It's as if the gift itself understands what each person needs." As word of these remarkable healings spread through Redemption Springs, people began arriving from across the territory and beyond. The Institute's patient rolls swelled, with individuals seeking help for conditions that had been declared hopeless by conventional medicine. Grace found herself working longer days than ever before, but instead of exhaustion, she felt energized by each success. Her partnership with Marcus had evolved into something even deeper. He'd become not just her protector and companion, but her anchor, the person who kept her grounded when the magnitude of human suffering threatened to overwhelm her. Dr. Hayes continued his meticulous documentation, building a case study collection that he believed could revolutionize medical understanding. And Dr. Vasquez provided the scientific framework that gave legitimacy to work that might otherwise be dismissed as superstition. But even as their success grew, so did the pressure from their opponents. Mrs. Ashworth arrived in Redemption Springs. On a cold December morning, accompanied by a federal marshal and a team of investigators. This time, she wasn't making offers or threats. She was conducting an official investigation into allegations of medical fraud and public endangerment. "Dr. Vasquez," Mrs. Ashworth said coldly as she entered the institute, "I'm here to inspect your facilities and interview your so-called patients. We have reports of dangerous pseudo-medical practices being conducted under the guise of legitimate treatment." Dr. Vasquez remained calm, her years of experience dealing with medical bureaucracy serving her well. "Of course, Mrs. Ashworth. You'll find our documentation comprehensive and our practices fully compliant with territorial medical regulations." But Mrs. Ashworth wasn't interested in documentation. Her goal was to find evidence, any evidence, that could be used to discredit Grace's work and justify federal intervention. The investigation that followed was thorough and intrusive. Federal marshals interviewed patients, examined medical records, and observed healing sessions with the skeptical eye of people looking for fraud rather than miracles. Grace endured the scrutiny with quiet dignity, understanding that this confrontation would determine not just her own future, but the future of everyone who might benefit from her gift. She continued her healing work under the watchful eyes of federal investigators, allowing her results to speak for themselves. The turning point came when Mrs. Ashworth herself demanded to observe a healing session involving Rebecca Mitchell, a child born with a severe facial deformity that had left her unable to speak or eat normally. Conventional surgery had been deemed too risky, leaving Rebecca's family with no options but to accept their daughter's limitations. "This should be interesting," Mrs. Ashworth said coldly as Grace approached the child. "Let's see if your supposed gift can address a condition that actual medical science has declared incurable." Grace knelt beside Rebecca's bed, looking into the child's eyes, one of which was severely malformed, and seeing not a medical challenge, but a little girl who deserved the chance to smile, to speak, to live without being stared at wherever she went. The healing that followed was Grace's most dramatic yet. Under the incredulous gaze of federal investigators, Rebecca's facial features began to reshape themselves. Bone structure realigned, tissue regenerated, and the malformed eye gradually took on normal appearance and function. When it was over, Rebecca looked up at her parents with two perfect eyes and spoke her first clear word, "Mama." The room fell into stunned silence. Even the most skeptical investigators couldn't deny what they'd witnessed, a transformation that went beyond any medical explanation they understood. Mrs. Ashworth's composure finally cracked. "This is impossible," she whispered. "There has to be some explanation, some trick." "The only trick," Grace said quietly, rising from Rebecca's bedside, "is believing that healing has to be limited by what we think we understand." Dr. Vasquez stepped forward with Rebecca's complete medical records. "Mrs. Ashworth, I have documentation of this child's condition from 3 independent medical examinations. Before and after photographs, x-rays, detailed medical histories. What you've witnessed is real, replicable, and thoroughly documented." The federal marshal who'd accompanied Mrs. Ashworth looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I'm not sure we have grounds to proceed with this investigation. What I've seen here appears to be legitimate medical practice, producing extraordinary results." Mrs. Ashworth's expression hardened with the fury of someone who'd finally encountered something she couldn't control or corrupt. "This isn't over," she said to Grace. "There are forces at work here that go beyond territorial law, forces that won't be impressed by parlor tricks, no matter how convincing." But as Mrs. Ashworth and her investigators departed, Grace felt a deep sense of completion settling over her. She'd found her purpose, proven her worth, and built something that would outlast any threats from people who saw healing as a commodity to be controlled. "What happens now?" Marcus asked as they watched the federal party's departure. "Now we keep Working? Grace replied simply. We help as many people as we can, for as long as we can, and we trust that good work will find a way to protect itself. Dr. Vasquez smiled. With the documentation we've built and the testimonials we've gathered, I believe we can make a strong case for permanent federal protection of this facility. What you've accomplished here, Grace, has changed how we understand the possibilities of healing. As spring returned to Redemption Springs, Grace stood in the Institute's garden, her hands deep in the rich soil as she tended to medicinal herbs that would support her healing work. Marcus worked beside her, their partnership having evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than either had imagined possible. "Do you ever think about that day at the auction?" Marcus asked as they worked. Grace smiled, remembering the frightened girl who'd stood on that platform, waiting for someone to determine her fate. "Sometimes, but that girl feels like a different person now." She was. "You've become someone extraordinary, Grace. Someone who chose to use her gift to change the world." Grace leaned into Marcus's shoulder, feeling the warmth of his love and the satisfaction of work that mattered. Around them, the sounds of the Institute carried on, patients finding hope, families being reunited with loved ones they'd thought lost to illness and injury, medical professionals discovering new possibilities for healing. "We've changed the world," Grace corrected gently, "all of us working together." As the sun set over Redemption Springs, casting golden light across the valley where the hot springs bubbled with their ancient promise of renewal, Grace Whitmore, once a blind girl sold at auction, now a healer whose touch had transformed countless lives, knew that she'd found her true home. It wasn't a place, but a purpose. It wasn't safety, but service. And it was more than enough for a lifetime of meaningful work ahead. The blind girl had become a beacon of hope, and her light would shine for generations of healers yet to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.